Hello, you're listening to the IoT Weekly Podcast. Hello and welcome to episode number 29 of the IoT Weekly Podcast, brought to you by Gearforge Software. My name is Matthew and I'm joined by my co-hosts and good friends Cliff and Zeineb. Hey guys, how's it going?
Doing pretty good here, Matthew.
How about you, Zeineb?
Basically same. It's kind of just summer laziness on my side.
Excellent. Well, so what have we been up to? Anything fun, Cliff?
I love doing visits. You know that, Matthew. So I got to visit a taconite or iron ore processing facility, specifically around an IoT implementation. Just one of the most amazing tours I've gotten. And I've visited lots and lots of manufacturing plants. And I can tell you this one is so different than what you'd normally visit.
It sounds really interesting.
Yep. So
what was the most exciting part or interesting part of that visit?
You know, what I thought was interesting is, and I think you and I spoke about this, I mean, parts of it actually looks like one of the maps in Battlefront.
Yeah, like you could just pick up a blaster and
Yeah, exactly. You're running around in that place. I mean,
yeah, you're right on the set.
Yep. I mean, you're in there with a hard hat and safety glasses and safety boots, and you're just kind of and it's loud in some spots and super hot in others, and the place is like 4 stories high. It's just intense.
Oh, that sounds really cool.
Very cool. Yep. How about you, Matthew?
Well, so over the weekend I had some deep fun with Git. I kind of dug into the internals a little bit and figured out how to do transparent encryption. Right directly natively in the repo, just using OpenSSL. And so basically the idea here is that when your code, let's say, gets checked out, it is in plain text, but when it gets checked in, it is actually encrypted before it goes into the database, so to speak. And so if you, let's say, you could have your code perfectly like public, basically, but without the key, nobody could actually read it. So limited use case for that, but I think there are some interesting cases, and it was kind of fun to dig around in the internals of Git. So
that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, it took about an hour. It was just something I was kind of playing around with. So
fun.
Yeah. So how about you, Zeineb? Anything fun?
I kind of feel a little embarrassed because I have been doing absolutely nothing, and it has been a blissful month. Like, yeah.
It shouldn't be embarrassment, Zeineb.
No, that sounds like
I wish I could do that.
Yeah.
That's what I would love to be like sitting on the river right now.
Yeah, I've got a whole stack of books I'd like to read.
Oh my gosh.
Sounds great.
It's just been the beach, sunlight, my dog who's going crazy in the background, and lots of binge watching series just every day.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
That does not sound bad at all.
No, I would agree.
So, Zeineb, did we get any feedback this week?
We haven't specifically gotten any feedback, but I mean, I'd love to have some. So if you guys, yeah, I mean, I like talking to everyone on Twitter. So if you guys have a message for us, you can always talk to us on Twitter, or you can send us an email at podcast@gearforgesoftware.com. And yeah, just talk to me.
Yeah, where are we on Twitter? What's our handle on Twitter?
Well, we're a little over 1,000, but we're a solid 1,000. You know how sometimes you lose followers?
Oh, yeah.
We're solid 1,000, so.
Nice.
And if you want to get in touch with us on Twitter, you can reach out to Gearforge IoT. That's our handle. So that's great. Yeah. Excellent. And Cliff, show sponsor today?
Our show sponsor today is Gearforge Software.
What?
So yeah, I know, super surprising, but it is. Gearforge Software, they're an IoT consultant that works with mid-sized companies. If you're ready to dip your toes in that connected world, If you don't know where to turn when figuring out your IoT strategy, give Gearforge Software a call and have a discussion. You can learn more at gearforgesoftware.com.
Excellent, excellent. Yes. All right. Well, it is time for our main segment, and we're going to do something a little different today. So usually we do headlines, kind of do our news, but we did have a request from listener James to talk about mesh networks, and so we're going to spend the time today talking about mesh networks. And I think a really good place for us to start would be to ask the question, what the heck is a mesh network?
Yeah, that is a great question.
Seems like a good thing to answer first, doesn't it?
I think so. So a mesh network is in your typical, let's just use the home as an example. I think
Okay.
it's a pretty easy thing, right, Matthew?
Yeah, good place to start. Yep.
Yep. So in my home, and probably like yours, I've got a Wi-Fi router.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to simplify things here, guys, but I've got a Wi-Fi router that happens to have a name, and then my laptop and my Xbox and all my devices, my phone and everything else, all connect up through my Wi-Fi.
Mm-hmm.
I presume yours is probably similar to that, right, Matthew?
Exact same thing.
Yep. So a mesh network is different. So what a mesh network would be is essentially a mesh network where each node, so if we think of the Wi-Fi router as kind of your router, but if you think of like your laptop and your Xbox and your PlayStation and your telephone, think of those as a node,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
So each one of those is actually connected to every other node in the network.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So it's sort of decentralized.
It's 100% decentralized. Yep, exactly. So it can actually talk to one node, could talk to another node, which could talk to another node. So the nice part about that is a lot of times it has the capability to do what's called self-healing.
Mm-hmm.
So it can figure out kind of shorter paths and things like that. So instead of having just one network device, you could have multiple nodes that are connected. And so your nodes could go through other nodes to find the most or the best route to push data up to the network.
Yeah, it's sort of like decentralized peer-to-peer pathfinding or something, right?
Yep,
Yeah, what's the
exactly.
shortest number, least number of hops to get to where
Hmm.
you need to go?
Hmm. Yep,
Yeah,
exactly.
so this is peer-to-peer networking. That's what we're talking about, and it's a mesh because instead of everything connecting to one hub and then out, it's everything connecting to each other like a net, right? Like.
Yep, a net's a great one. In our show notes, we've got like a chain link fence,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because think about how each little part of a chain link fence are connected to each other.
Mhm.
So very much just like you said, just like a net basically is how they're typically, and one side of the net on the one side could talk all the way over to the other side if that's the best route for that net or that node to get through.
Sure, sure.
So it's not like you have to talk, but it's a good scenario to do that.
Interesting.
Yep. Yep.
My
So
question is,
yeah.
when you have a decentralized system like that, doesn't that like kind of make it perfect for IoT?
Potentially. So I mean, I always come back to a lot of folks are saying like, hey, IoT mesh network, it's the only way to go.
Mhm.
And as an example, is let's say you're in a mine, an underground mine, okay?
Mhm.
Right.
And down in the mine, if you think about this, you won't have access to mobile networks or even Wi-Fi. You probably have access either somewhere out on the mountain or somewhere on some sort of shack or some sort of building outside, typically, of the actual facility, right?
Mhm.
So leveraging a mesh network, you can actually set up your IoT nodes throughout the mine and let them figure out how to get that or those packets of information by using other nodes to get it to the surface, right? So that way you don't have to sit there and run physical wire from the bottom to the top, because in many cases you can't run physical wire. It's not possible.
Yeah. Yeah, and
There's like rocks in your way.
exactly. But I think this brings up a good point. So when we're describing these networks, I mean, what you said initially sounds kind of like a free for all, but usually if we're talking about an IoT implementation of a mesh network, this is not a free for all. This is, you sort of can think about those nodes, right? They play different roles. So
Yep.
you might have nodes that do nothing but pass messages, basically up, right, out
Yeah.
of your mine, and which isn't really that different from a relay if you're
Mhm.
thinking about like a more traditional Wi-Fi setup, right?
Exactly.
And somewhere there's going to be a gateway, most likely, right? Like, this is like not a new internet. This is connecting to the internet at some level. It's just, how do you get all these messages from all these diverse places essentially routed out efficiently,
Yep.
right?
Yes, most definitely. And you may, let's say if you're in a factory type scenario, you may end up connecting it to a redundant network system, right? So that way you can have redundancy in your network.
Right.
Uh, but yeah, you're entirely right. In most cases, you're going to be pushing these through. In some cases, though, if you've got cellular, you may be leveraging additional cellular nodes along the way.
Yeah, I was just going to bring that up. I mean, the gateway might be cellular,
Yep, very
because
much.
that, yeah, and we've seen quite a few cases where it's actually better
Yeah.
if they just use a cell connection.
Well, and let's take a step back now. There are some situations where you probably don't need a mesh network.
Mhm.
If you have a single location that you need to monitor, right, and your
Mhm.
sensors are coming back to that, and in some situations you're better off just having a singular type of system, similar to like your home networking, where
Mhm.
you're just firing your message via radio or something like that to your gateway and then firing it out.
Right.
So, I mean, that's similar to, let's say, a Helium, right?
Yeah.
Um, when we talked with them, they can connect up many devices to the gateway. So this is more of a gateway type device.
Yeah, each device talks to the gateway. There's no
Yep,
mesh activity happening.
exactly. But I
Yeah.
mean, the nice thing with, let's say, a Helium, you can have multiple gateways and it will connect up based on um, whatever
Yeah.
one is the most appropriate.
Right, which is closest or best signal or whatever
Yep.
the algorithm is.
Yep, exactly. So
Yeah.
that's a really good thing because one of the big questions he was asking about is a comparison of kind of what's called BT mesh. So BT mesh is based off of what I understand is um, a home mesh network that's provided by the British Telecom company.
Sure.
And I've got a link here in the show notes to it, but where they provide little discs and the mesh basically will give you the best signal throughout the entire house.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is kind of an intriguing idea, just even outside of the IoT realm. The idea that you might be, again, it's not that different really from having sort of a repeater,
Yep.
a Wi-Fi repeater, except the thing is, I've never had great luck with those. So the other question I would have is, is a mesh network, there must be some inherent additional complexity. Like, you think about the complexity of troubleshooting a traditional network.
Yeah.
There must be additional complexity for a mesh network, and what's the overhead of that? You know what I mean?
Hmm.
It's kind of an interesting thing that I just wonder about.
Yeah. Um, and I think you're right though, exactly with the additional complexity because I put down some additional mesh network examples. So
Yeah.
Thread, that's a network designed for home networks. Um, Digi mesh and Zigbee mesh. Those are two very similar meshes. I've got a link here that kind of gives the description, so you can actually see what they're like. They've been around for quite some time now. And then also you've got Particle, who's coming up with a mesh um, network also. So, but they're not even out. They're looking at potentially September. And I know um, James was kind of curious if we think they'll actually hit the mark or not too.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. I don't know. What do you think?
Yes, I mean, here's the thing. I know they had originally said, "Yep, we'll have it by the beginning of summer," right?
Mhm.
I mean, if you look at the actual, and I put a link again in the show notes here to the actual site, I don't know. I'm on the fence if they're actually going to make it or not. Just what worries me is I mean, if you look at actually the time frame they've got here, I mean, it's a fairly aggressive time frame to actually get these out. So
Mm.
as we know, you and I, when developing hardware, I mean, I think hardware personally is probably one of the trickiest things you've got to do.
Well, yeah, it comes with some complexities that software just doesn't. You can ship software, especially, I guess I'm thinking server side, probably mostly. Uh, but you can ship software that's not 100% baked, and in a
Yep.
lot of cases, that's not a big deal because you'll add the features that are missing, or correct the little bugs, as users run across them. But with hardware, you can't do that. It's got to be right, and when it needs to connect to something, all that stuff has to also work and be tested, and yeah. Otherwise, you can ship something that's just a brick.
Yeah, and their firmware based off of their site, their firmware is not even ready yet for production,
Oh yeah, yeah.
just the
Yeah,
software.
they got some work to do.
So if I had to put a prediction, I'm betting my money it's probably more like November
Sure.
is I think what's going to happen.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I just know how complex it can be to develop some hardware, and and their beta is supposed to be coming out in July. So having
Hmm.
beta roll out and then getting it all kind of pulled back together for mass production by September, I don't know, that's a tight window, I think.
Yeah, it might be a little too close, but yeah, they're probably not too far behind if they're planning beta in middle of the summer.
Yeah,
Yeah, but September might be too close.
I might be. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
we'll
that's a
see.
tough one. I did mention a couple other networks that are not mesh, and I
Yeah,
think the question is really like fundamentally is like, why would you use a mesh network or similar to kind of what Zeineb had said is why not use a mesh network for everything?
right. So tell us about that. Networks that are not mesh.
Yep. Well, and a lot of, I mean, if you read some articles on mesh networks, a lot of them are really specific to, let's say, indoor use cases.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Um, but they're saying in a mesh network, some of the interesting use cases might be, let's say you want to build a mesh network in a city, right?
Right. Right.
So that way you can have all these interconnected devices.
Hmm.
And this goes back to something that we talked about in a previous article where having kind of these localized nodes, you could also then use them for geolocation. Remember
Yep.
that article from back a
Totally.
while ago?
Yep.
So I mean, those are some interesting things too. But no, back to what you'd asked, like some of those that are not. So you have LoRa. I mean,
Or
LoRa is not a mesh network.
yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you can actually, if you wanted to, you could rewrite it into a mesh network.
Mhm.
But based off of what I've seen, it would actually there's significant work to do that.
Um, I believe it. So the next one on the list I thought was interesting, given that we've talked to Helium.
Yep.
So they are not a mesh network
It's not considered a mesh network in the
because the
traditional sense.
individual nodes, those devices don't talk to each other. They do talk to the gateway. The gateway, you could have many gateways, which
Yep.
sort of moving toward mesh-ish.
Yep.
Those gateways aren't necessarily talking to each other either. I guess I don't know that for a fact, but that's what I have in my head. It's just the device is connecting to whichever one makes the most sense, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And so the other side too is I'm on the fence with regards to the particle mesh, Matthew. Is it
Yeah.
truly a mesh network? Because actually what happens is you have the argon and the boron.
Hmm.
And the argon is a Wi-Fi mesh, the boron's an LTE, so cellular
Right.
mesh.
Yep.
What happens though is you have to still deploy what's called a xenon, which is the node that then connects up to the network. So I mean, your nodes don't I mean, they call it a mesh, but realistically, their nodes don't talk to each other based off what I understand.
Oh,
And, and,
interesting.
and I could be wrong here if someone has a better understanding, but based off what I've read, I can't see where the xenon will connect to another xenon.
Hmm. Well, yeah, that's interesting then. And I guess maybe in terms of the definition of a mesh network, that it's also possible that that's fluid, if if I could put it that way, right? That
Yeah.
people are calling things mesh networks that might not strictly be,
Hmm.
but that it's more of a, I don't know, like a broad category as opposed to a very specific definition.
Yeah.
That makes sense, you know? But that doesn't sound like the mesh network that we talked about at the beginning of the episode.
Yeah.
Certainly.
And if I'm wrong, please let me know. Um, but I didn't based off of my understanding, I didn't understand that the nodes actually can speak to each other.
Hmm.
Well, actually, here it actually says it's a network repeater, so maybe it can actually. I just dug into the specs actually.
Yeah,
So
maybe it has a couple of
yeah.
capabilities there. Connect as a node or a repeater, in which case definitely mesh.
Oh, so it can act either as an endpoint or repeater,
Not both, one or the
not
other.
both. So that explains why it's written the way it is. That makes total
Yeah,
sense.
yeah.
So yeah, so in full traditional sense, not 100%, but it sounds like it's almost like a hybrid approach is really what it is.
Well, I don't know that there's no requirement that the node or the endpoint and the repeater be different devices, right?
Not true.
I mean, just as long as, I mean, you get the mesh effect as long as a node can repeat.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep. So that's yeah.
Interesting. And what about Sigfox?
Yep. So Sigfox, as you know, we've been trying to get them on the show here for a little bit, but they're another provider. I'm not going to say they're like LoRa, but they are similar, right? As far as they're not considered a mesh network, and similar to like InWave. So again, additional technologies to be able to take devices, basically the transmitters, receivers, and leverage those and connect them up to gateways and be able to get those back to some sort of internet connectivity.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
Hmm.
And so here's my question.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of talk about these mesh networks. I think there's a lot of excitement around it, maybe just because it's relatively kind of new and, you know, people are kind of buzzed about that idea. But at the end of the day, as long as the devices can successfully talk to what they need to talk to, why does it matter? What do you
Yeah,
think?
the only thing I can think of is the mining example is a good example of like needing to relay information up the chain, basically. Or it's a situation where it's really dense and you really can't send a broadcast radio signal because you've got issues maybe with RF or something like that.
Hmm.
You actually do need to create more of a network-based system,
Hmm.
be able to kind of relay. I think in most cases you're probably not going to incorporate a mesh because trying to make sure you have those things set up so they can actually talk to each other and network, like you said, troubleshooting and things like that, I think
Yeah.
it's going to be more difficult.
Yeah, so it's probably not going to take over the world.
No, I think you're
I
going to
think
stick with more of a gateway-based system.
Yeah, there'll probably be cases where it makes the most sense. It'll solve problems that are difficult to solve now. But yeah,
And
interesting.
the big question I think James had asked was specifically about leveraging the mesh in an outdoor scenario.
Hmm.
And I guess in my personal opinion, and mind you, I'm not, um, I don't know, take it as you will, I guess you'd say.
Hmm.
I probably would not do a mesh if I was outside. It
Right.
doesn't as much sense because from just like even using LoRa or helium or even
Seems
particle,
more straightforward, doesn't it?
it is. You typically don't have buildings blocking you and things of that sort. So you've got much farther line of sight and everything else. So it's
Yeah,
easier.
as long as your range is okay.
Yeah, and your range is always better outdoors than indoors.
Totally.
So I mean that's the key part right there.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. Hey, Cliff, do you know anything about the security on these items? I'm just super curious in terms of you've got all these nodes and they're relaying data. And after talking to Helium, I understand how they're handling their security. I'm
Yeah.
just curious if you've read anything about mesh networks and security.
Yeah, the only thing I read was that they say that typically mesh networks are, where did I see this? They had the advantages of security and reliability,
Hmm.
because you've got to be part of that network to actually communicate with everybody. But I've got to believe that realistically, it still comes down to the protocol and everything else that you're leveraging.
Well, here's why I ask is, so I get I understand helium we're sort of defining as not a traditional mesh network. They're connecting to the gateway, but basically they have a cert on
Yeah.
each device, right? And from the time the data leaves the device to the time it gets to your server, it's encrypted. Data's
Hmm.
encrypted. And so I can understand that case with all these little nodes and repeaters out there, just wondering how secure that really is, right? And the problem is with any device, the problem is always if somebody can get their hands on the device, right? They
Hmm.
could potentially compromise it in some way. So I'm just, it's just interesting. Does that provide more opportunities, or is it about the same? One way or the other, you've got sensors in the field, you've got devices in the field, you've got gateways in the field, and you need to make sure those are locked down in such a way that physically locked down in such a way that somebody can't readily access and potentially compromise your network.
I've got to go back to what you're just saying right there, Matthew. I think it's going to come back to that because I mean, realistically, you can still um, uh, if you've got a rogue device, and remember that what was the when you were talking about Apple essentially and being able to essentially
Yeah,
look
you
like
could.
it's an Apple device. You remember that?
Yeah, you could hijack. You could get your way onto a private network
Yep.
by basically masquerading your smart device as if it were part of that network, and and Apple would turn over the network credentials for the network, basically.
And that's why I think no matter what, you introduce a node into the mesh network, and if there's security vulnerabilities of that device, right, you could
Right.
still have the same issue.
Well, and again, that's kind of where my brain was going with that question.
Yep.
Is the more of those that you have, the more opportunities there are for, like, how do you even keep track? How do you know that you have a rogue, you know, or one that's been tampered with? I don't know. Just,
That's I don't know. That's a great question.
yeah, I don't know what the possibilities are, but it's sort of what was in my head is like, well, all of these things have to be secure, but the more of them you have, the more things you have to make sure are secure. So does that open up additional, potential for security problems?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great question. So if you're a network guy and this is kind of your thing, we would love to know your thoughts specifically around security and mesh networks. I don't
Yeah.
claim to be a network guy, Matthew. That's probably the one of the least favorite spots in school for me.
Sure.
I enjoyed the math of it, but that's all I enjoyed about when networking came up.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think it has its fun bits, but it's not what I'm particularly attracted to either.
So
I did want to mention, I did find this Libre Mesh, open source mesh network, open source firmware, open source software, and I don't know how much traction this has, but I did want to just bring it up. I've never used it, don't know anything about it, other than that it exists.
that's interesting. Look at that. Yeah, I just seen that too. Wonder where they're out of.
Yeah, I don't know, but the examples seem to be in Europe, so I don't know if
Yeah.
they're based in Europe or what. But
Hmm.
looks like they are funded by Mark Shuttleworth, who, of course, is the owner of Ubuntu, the canonical company that creates Ubuntu, the Linux distribution.
Well, and it looks like they've had an update this year recently, so it's not like it hasn't been actually. It's not like they were not working on it.
Yeah, it does seem to be. It does seem to be active. I do see that the website is offers Italian and English. So
Nice. Yeah, that's slick.
yeah. So anyway, something to note. Don't know anything about it, but um, definitely looks like an interesting project if you're interested in the open source world.
Yeah, there you go. Great find, Matthew.
Thanks. All right. Well, do we have anything else we want to talk about mesh networks?
I think we covered quite a bit. I mean, the key point I think was really specifically around indoor versus outdoor as far as the mesh network, and it still comes back to I think the situation that you're trying to do it in. Don't force the tech, right? I think say that all the time.
Right. Well, and I mean, the one thing, it's not particular to mesh networks, it's particular to anything with technology, is best thing you can ever possibly do is try to keep it as simple as you can.
What?
Yeah.
Why would I want to do that?
Well, because it's just a lot more work when you don't.
Oh, but it's so much cooler when it's so complex. I don't even understand it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Hold on, let me pull out the diagram. Wait a minute.
Yes.
I can't remember. Yes. Complex systems, so, to do something really cool, sometimes it does require a lot of complexity, but the best case scenario in any technology project is to try to keep it as simple as you possibly can. Are you sure you really need that extra requirement? So, yes, as you said, don't force the tech. Keep it simple.
Yeah, I would
Do what
totally
makes
agree.
sense.
Yeah, if you don't need a mesh network, you can get by with just a simple gateway system with some redundancy. Take that route.
Simplest thing that can possibly work. It's the Unix mantra.
Yes.
All right. Well, this is great. I thought that was a really interesting discussion. And we would love to hear from you if you've got comments or questions about mesh networks. If you've worked with mesh networks and just want to give us some feedback, that'd be great. Or if you have anything else you want to tell us about, excellent. You can contact us at podcast@gearforgesoftware.com. That's our email. Or we are on Twitter at Gearforge IoT, and Zeineb will be happy to talk to you there. So we would love to hear from you. Either way, please do send in your feedback. We really do appreciate it. So that just about wraps things up for this week's episode. Do you guys have anything fun planned for the weekend? Cliff, how about you?
Well, I started to try to play golf, and that's just I tell you, I look so goofy trying to do it. So I am going to be heading out with my son Cooper tomorrow, and we're going to see if we can't play a golf course.
That sounds like fun. Excellent.
Yes.
Zeineb, how about you?
I'm gonna try to figure out more about LoRa because I was just doing my research today and I realized, oh man, this sounds really cool. So, gonna do some homework aside from all the summer laziness, try to play the guitar again, and maybe try to figure out the charm behind golf because I don't get it.
What about you, Matthew?
Well, I feel like at this point I just do nothing but mow the lawn. But so tomorrow is the last day of this big book sale near us. It's gone on for 2 weeks. This is the huge one I was telling you about. Yeah, it is really insane. We went back last weekend too, and picked up some more just fun little books for cheap. And so we'll probably go back and see what's left.
And a side note, Matthew looks like he's building a second wing on the house now for all these books from the book fair. So
we're building a third wing now for the book.
Oh, sorry, third wing now.
Yeah.
All the books.
The second wing is already full.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, and they have books delivered every day too. So they have so many books. It's crazy.
Yeah, we are kind of book people. That's true. So, folks, thank you so much for listening, and we do hope that you'll join us again for next week's show. And until then, so long and be well. Bye, you guys.
Bye.
Bye.